Hello everyone. I'm at the West Tennessee Agriculture Museum in Milan, Tennessee, and behind me is a log cabin that Governor Gordon Browning was born in. We're going to go with Brent Cox today to the site where this log cabin originally was, and then we're going to go to the Gordon Browning Museum in McKenzie, Tennessee.
We're here at the Governor Gordon Browning log cabin site. It was built by his great-grandfather John A. Browning, and it was here about 1838. And then right behind us we have the cemetery of Governor Browning's grandfather and many of his family members, including the Kaiser's German Shepherd he captured at the end of World War I. Located here at William Browning's log cabin site, and John A. Browning, his father, would settle here about 1838, and this is the Browning Cemetery. And John Browning and William Franklin Browning are both buried here, and as well the Kaiser's dog is buried behind me.
We're here now at the Governor Gordon Browning Museum in McKenzie, Tennessee, and Brent Cox, who is the curator here and is a cousin to Gordon Browning, is going to tell us about the life of Gordon Browning.
Welcome to the museum. I might go back to the cabin that we were at earlier and talk just a minute about his childhood and growing up and what led him to become such a great inspiration and servant to the state of Tennessee and the United States, and for that matter, in a lot of cases, we could say the world. Gordon Browning was born in 1889 south of Atwood, Tennessee, and you've seen the locations now. You've seen this cabin that he was born in. You sleep in the top loft to the left, and was born in that cabin. The cabin actually was built by his great-grandfather John Browning from Union County, South Carolina, and he and his son William Franklin Browning are going to end up staying at the original cabin site, and James Harvey Browning, which is the father of Gordon Browning. So Browning spent his first few years living in that cabin. Eventually they're going to move it down the road into what's called Old Atwood, Tennessee, which is near Clark's Mountain. If you haven't heard of it, you'll have a good time finding out where it's at. But it is outside of Atwood, Tennessee. And at that point in his life, there's not anything really about Gordon Browning that sets him off as being anything special. He's a normal kid, he's smart. Smarter than his brother was. Not to say anything, but they sort of competed against each other. But when Gordon was young and sitting in that cabin, his grandfather used to talk about politics a lot to him. And of course, the famous War of the Roses in Tennessee, where we had brothers running against each other and they were fiddling to see which one played better. Things like that played into his mind. You wouldn't think about it, but The Wizard of Oz becomes a movie later, but if you remember being in book form, that too played a big role in Gordon Browning's life and has to do with the election of 1896. So as a young child, his grandfather taught him all about being a populist. And populism was a new breed of politics coming into America that would lead to progressivism. So that's where he learned his political thinking. Now, keeping in mind his mother's family lives down the road and they're on the opposite side of the political spectrum entirely. But he mentions in his autobiography that he was definitely a populist, and it's going to play a big role in the rest of his life. He ends up moving to Milan, and they seem to be doing fairly well. You will see pictures of that house they lived in. It's a nice two-story brick house. It needs to be repaired now, but there's nothing that can be done about that. It's located in the Milan Arsenal. But as he was going to high school, he and his brother would walk to Milan College, as it was called then, And for 2 years he went there, and he graduates in the class of 1908. And then from that point, he starts trying to make a decision what he's going to do in life. First thing he did is he's a school teacher at Ebenezer School, right on the Madison, Gibson, and Carroll County line. And after that, he taught at Chapel Hill, which Chapel Hill Church is well noted in Gibson County this day. In fact, his whole family's almost moved to Gibson County except for Gordon. He's there at this point, but he's going to spend most of his life in Carroll County. After he teaches, he decides he wants to go to college. He chose Valparaiso, and the reason being there were 35 different countries represented there, and he felt a strong need to have international influences upon his life. It's almost like he knew the future. It sort of starts reminding of George Patton and thinking he'd lived many lives before. But he goes there, then he comes back to Lebanon, Tennessee, Cumberland University, gets a law degree. He practices law a little bit in Huntington, but soon after that begins, we have a war break out. Of course, Mama told him right off, Gordon, I don't want you going to World War I and getting involved over there. And at the same time, she wrote down in the diary that I knew he was going to go. And of course, he gets promoted to captain immediately because of the fact that he has some stature in society. And as you know, back in the old days, you didn't necessarily have to be a good military person in order to become a military officer. But he was a very good soldier. And he was in the 114th Field Artillery. So when World War I breaks out, Gordon's going to go with the troops of our area. And I'm sitting right now in Carroll County, Tennessee. Henry County and all those counties that surround Carroll County were involved. The 114th Battery D is organized. He goes into the training camp at Fort Severe and as Battery D, but soon after he was promoted to senior captain, so he took over Battery A. They didn't suffer as bad as some of the other batteries, but then again, it was the key battery and you have the senior captain. And he goes through the war and he does a very fine job. He's noticed for his service to the United States. He also, at the end of it, happened to be one of the lucky guys and happened to find a trophy that very few people ever get a chance to get. He was among the people that captured the Kaiser, and he managed to bring the German Shepherd of the Kaiser of Germany back to his home. And that dog, as we said earlier, is buried in the cemetery where his grandfather and his great-grandfather are buried. So Gordon has a life started. He's pretty well established. He decides he wants to take a chance at politics. And keeping in mind at the same time, he has cousins that are in Florida as politicians. He also has family members that have influenced him, so he goes into politics. He ends up being in the U.S. Congress 13 years. Did a lot of neat things about his period in Congress. Of course, you're going through the Roaring 20s, and you're going to go to the bottom end of it, which is the Great Depression. It's about that time Gordon Brown is going to run for governor. And he ends up becoming governor of Tennessee in 1937. That's going to play a big role in his life. You wouldn't really think that would, just being governor one time, but it's going to put him on an international stage very soon. So he ends up serving that term out, and then Tommy Rye, the governor of Tennessee, and that time is going to offer him a position in the military and to go over in World War II and serve as a civil officer. And he ends up going over there, and they're sort of keeping this secretive, but he's been given a little bit more control than people realize because he had just been governor. He was a veteran of World War I. He's got time in U.S. Congress. He's the perfect guy that you could get that could pretty well go any direction you needed him to go. So when World War II starts, they asked him to come immediately over to Europe. And he basically told them, I will go under one condition. And one condition is that he had the time of 6 months to raise his rank from captain to colonel to make sure that he's at least respected. Now keep in mind, he's going to have captain for a while when he gets to Europe, but Eventually, the colonel comes through and they call him by colonel, but there's a few parts of his life where you'll hear the word captain mentioned even in World War II. But basically, he becomes a part of the committee that is forming Normandy, the D-Day invasion. But something that we don't know here at the museum, because you could never possibly read all the documents we have of Gordon Browning if you spent your whole lifetime. But Gordon Browning obviously was in North Africa too. We do not know what role he played in North Africa. We know that he went up into Italy with them, and we know that he was around a lot of very famous battles, and for that matter, Patton and people like Omar Bradley. He was friends with all of them during the war. And Gordon ends up going through that and then immediately being called to England. And that's when he decides he wants to sort of show off, you know, I'm in England. I can never forget the picture because he's standing at Stonehenge in his colonel's uniform, and he wants everybody to see that I'm at Stonehenge. And Gordon did like to send stuff back home so that people would know what was going on. He sent a lot of odd things. In fact, he talked about a place called Scobone, Tennessee at Birmingham Palace to one of the guards, and then ended up all over the British press and in America. And Gordon loves Scobone, Tennessee. But anyhow, he's over there. He helps plan the Normandy invasion, or D-Day. And the funny thing about it, all the generals of the Allied forces, as you know, Dwight David Eisenhower has just become the Allied commander. What happens right after it is they're having the meeting to plan the exact invasion. Well, things sort of are taking time, and the generals that are there, obviously French and several other countries, English, and of course Americans. And finally the British general that was sitting in there, General Hines, asked, he said, "What's the holdup?" And Eisenhower looked at him and said, very reluctantly, "We're waiting for the captain who commands generals." So Eisenhower's going back to a rank he held at an earlier time, but at the same time, Eisenhower had been told by FDR, later Truman would tell Eisenhower that whatever Browning tells you to do, you do it. You have to think back why. It was because he had very good knowledge of politics. He knew how to take care of towns. While that invasion's going on, he's going to be setting up governments in each town after they're captured. He also has U.S. Congress background, so he knows politicking. And he also knows war, which it's a weird thing. You read the books where he's quoted, he never really seems to act like he's in a real battle. In fact, at times you're reading his early books in World War I, what he wrote, you almost think that he didn't even see combat. But later on, I found out that he was definitely in a big mess. And but he said, "I just think I got some dirt on me in the war. That's about it." And very, very typical of a Southern boy. He had a lot of pride. He calls himself puritanical. So you got a guy over there in Europe that's holding on to some new knowledge he learned while in college, but at the same time, he's learning to run the military. And it doesn't take too many times you tell Eisenhower what to do that you realize you sort of got control. That's where Browning was. Americans didn't know that. People in Gibson and Carroll County where he had lived didn't know that. But all you have to do is go through his papers right here at the museum, and you will see that he was controlling Eisenhower in every way. And the main reason is his men would go in with the airborne, and they would land behind lines. And the minute the airborne established any kind of control, part of Gordon Browning's staff would go out and start organizing the towns. So like as the army passes through, he creates a government. And of course, he's going to be the first American to cross into Germany and will be the first to cross the Rhine River. They actually did 5 filmings of that because Patton was involved in the last 4, and Patton wanted to make sure they had one that looked good. We actually have pictures here at the museum where Browning wrote on the bottom of it, "I was the first person to enter Germany." And of course, he's going to have a big role in what goes on. He'll immediately after the war is coming to a close, Browning's going to end up being the governor of Luxembourg and Belgium, the military governor. And of course, as many of you probably have heard in history, Patton ran his mouth a little too much, and he got knocked out of the American occupation zone. So in comes Gordon Browning, and he takes control, creates the denazification program, and as well, he organizes the American occupation zone. But he seems to be all over the place, and somehow when Nuremberg comes around, he ends up being in charge of the Nuremberg trials. And that's why he ends up with Hermann Goering's cigar, which we have here in the museum. He brought a few other trophies home naturally, but there's not a lot of that stuff that we have. We do have all the uniforms, and if you can see off behind me, you'll notice Eisenhower's patch on this one uniform. Actually, every uniform he had during World War II has Eisenhower's patch. And if you look at the pictures of his staff, you will see that he's always sitting pretty close to center. He was called the Deputy Chief of Staff, but according to FDR's words and later Truman, it's very clear he is his Chief of Staff because he's telling the boss what to do, even when the Chief of Staff doesn't even have that right. He can, suggest things, but Chief of Staff didn't have that authority. Gordon Browning had complete authority. He ended up staying 2 more years in Europe, and he went through the whole program and got everything set up. America was doing fine in its role, and then his wife tells him, you either come home or I'm going to divorce you. And he had begged her through the whole war, come over here. This is a fine place. You'll love being in these beautiful homes. And of course, Gordon had the best choice because he's always near Eisenhower. So eventually he comes back home and literally goes into the house. He's with his wife. They're sitting around and they get a knock on the door. And Gordon gets up and goes and opens the door, and he recognizes the people immediately as politicians, and they said, Governor Browning. And of course, they're calling him governor. Most military people are still calling him colonel. But they said, Governor Browning, would you run for governor again? And he said, well, I have to ask my wife. And he said, well, there's a problem. We've already nominated you as the Democratic candidate for governor. Now, keeping in mind, once again, populism and progressivism, because being in the Depression era, he took part in bringing electricity to Tennessee. He was very much a person that reorganized the country, so he had a very progressive way of thinking. That might be complicated in today's terms to describe, and I'm not going to get into that deeply because some people today don't understand the difference between like socialists and communists and things of that nature, so it gets to be a blurry part of history. But Gordon will get elected. And of course, Tennessee always being the odd state that it is, the second election will be election 3, but the second time after World War II, he runs again. And Roy Acuff is picked to run against him. And of course, Gordon loved music. Gordon was very good friends with people like Hank Williams Sr., the Grand Ole Opry. He loved to go to the shows that were out near Skullbone, Tennessee, when the Grand Ole Opry played out there. And Gordon knew these people, but here he is running against Roy Acuff. And of course, Roy Acuff's king country music. So we're sort of going back to the War of the Roses when we had the 2 Fiddling Brothers run for governor, but they actually, Alf and Bob Taylor, traveled in the same car together, slept in the same motel rooms, are said to have stolen each other's speeches. By the way, making mention that Bob Taylor was one of Gordon Browning's favorite politicians and had been governor of Tennessee 2 times, and brother Alfred served 1 time. They were on opposite sides of the political spectrum in that family. In fact, I hear there were 3 of them. But anyhow, Gordon goes back in. He does pretty well through his terms. He is one of the people that created Armed Forces Day. And in Nashville, Tennessee, the very first, or the beginning of it starts with Gordon Browning's parade being the first in the United States in honor of the Armed Forces. Browning's going to spend his life honoring the U.S. military. He's so involved in the American Legion, everything that you can imagine, and at the same time in politics. He will run 2 more times against Frank McCord, but he loses those elections. He did hold on to some grudges about those 2 elections, but at the same time, he kept in service of the United States. So if you think back to what I told you about his wife begging him to come home, you keep in mind I haven't mentioned her since I said that. His wife went with him everywhere in Tennessee, so it was different. She did live in the governor's mansion. But the fact is, she wanted to come home, and Gordon would try to come home every so often. But he was always being pulled aside. You can see the importance of this man by the type of people that are pulling him aside. Like when George Marshall pulls him aside to be advised on the creation of what's going to become NATO. Gordon Browning's involved. The Atomic Energy Commission, whenever they're basically starting out in the late 40s, you know, we've already had an atomic bomb, but not like what's going to happen. And they're going through the period of creating a commission that will organize it on a larger level. As you know, we're starting to get ourselves quickly embedded into a Cold War. Browning's going to take part in that. Now, you got to keep in mind, born in 1889, and we're going to be in the 1960s, and you still see him appearing in high political positions without any title at all. But everybody always calls him Colonel. He prefers that and even tells them that. But as the years pass after that, he continues to go to every place you can imagine visiting. He's always a showman. He helps every president that's in his party basically campaign all through the region of Carroll County. Any county they wanted him, Browning would go to. He always felt that he was a servant to the people, and he always told people, if I had it my way, I first serve God. And he said, after that, I serve Tennessee. Lastly, I serve the United States. Now, you really think about what he's telling you there is that he is a Tennessean. It almost reminds you of some people back in history that took preference over their state to their nation. Now, at this point, what I've told you, put him on an international level in about every way that you can imagine. But once again, for some reason today, I find it highly odd that very few people seem to know about him. And he's sort of one of those lost heroes of history. But believe me, he was involved in about everything you can imagine. His last years, he's going to end up in a wheelchair. He gets Parkinson's disease. And by 1976, Governor Browning, after spending 121 days in the hospital, is going to pass away. And he's going to be buried in the Democrats' cemetery in Huntington, Tennessee. Just to give you a little bit more about that, because we're actually going on a museum tour as well. The Democrats and Republicans were so divided in this county that even in the American Civil War, Carroll County split down the middle and would not secede. They do have two cemeteries over there. All Republicans are buried in one and all Democrats are in the other. So Governor Browning today rests in the Democrat Cemetery, or Clark Cemetery in Huntington, Tennessee.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, please check out the other video we did where Brent Cox gave us a tour of the museum. If you're ever in McKenzie, be sure to stop by and check out the Governor Gordon Browning Museum. As always, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. So long, everyone.